We keep praying about. Let's pray that there's a computer tech in the group.
Amen.
Pastor is too easily distracted.
Amen.
My inner child. Today's message is kind of convenient that we are a group of people a little further along in life, and we don't have to dance around certain things for the sake of the children. Because we're going to talk a little bit about circumcision today, and this is a word that even amongst adults makes some people uncomfortable. But you needn't be. You needn't be, and stick with me on this. We lived on a block in Brooklyn that was part of a historical development of that neighborhood. 100 years before, it had been beachfront. And what they do in New York City is when they dig a basement, they dump it on the edge of the islands, and they make the place bigger. When they built the trade towers, they added a 16-acre site to Manhattan, which has been completely developed, and it's a very fashionable, upper crusty kind of place to live this day. Well, they didn't create a fashionable upper crusty place to live where we were, but they did create literally a couple extra blocks out of years and years of building in the Brooklyn area. It was a place that had been, from its inception till only shortly before we got there, traditional Brooklyn, Irish and Italian. Irish and Italian. In fact, it was kind of like a 2.5 bedroom thing that we all had. You know, these cookie cutter houses where you walk in and the first thing you say is, oh, you did that with that. Because we all have the that. We just do different things with it, right? And one of the houses had been home to a family that raised 8 children. So there were 10 people in this home. And they had no complaints about it, you know. And that was the neighborhood until we moved in and changed the face of the neighborhood here.
Yes.
It's not always a matter of the hue. You can change a neighborhood simply by not being like everybody else. In fact, we moved in November, late November, and we threw an open house in December. We figured with the holiday maybe people would come, and some people did. But it landed on a day when it was so hot in December, we had our windows open, which allowed us to hear the neighbor next door with many profane curses saying there was no way that he was going to come to that. You can go, but I'm not going. Well, he was upset because we lived there, and he hadn't gotten approval of our moving into the neighborhood. He had a friend who he thought would have been a better neighbor, and so forth. So we were changing the block, but shortly thereafter, one of the homes on the block changed that everybody was glad, even me. Not because of any racial issue or anything, or religious or anything like that. It's just that the homeowner had been renting to whoever, and at any given time there were like 8 adults in there whose lifestyle was questionable and who didn't care about the home, you know, was all overgrown out front, and it was just an eyesore and not pleasant for the neighbors to be dealing with this in their neighborhood. They moved out, he sold the building, and a Jewish family moved in. Now we're really talking change for these people. And they were not any stereotype either. In Brooklyn, people think that all Jews have money or have access to money. These were lower middle class working people like the rest of us, you know. And we got to know them somewhat over the years. And they hadn't been there 6 months or so when I went out to the car one day and witnessed the mohel. You don't know what that is, do you? That's the rabbi who's trained to do circumcisions. He knows how to do it and not harm and all of that. And he's followed by his assistant and he's got all the trappings. And I knew one of the things, just from my own study, is the special pillow that they would put the baby on. You know, it was all embroidered and so forth with Jewish symbols and things. And after he got there, then their community began to show up. And there were a lot of people in this home because there was going to be a bris, which is the Hebrew word for circumcision.
Bris.
Bris. Almost as if it was spelled B-R-I-S, but it's not quite. Avenue T was going to have a bris. And I introduced that because one of the things I think would help us to understand when we read these passages is to understand that what Paul is talking about is a whole lot more than elective surgery. Okay? A cultural option, or whatever you want to think of it as. It's a community event, and it is deeply a part of being in that community, being a Jew. And rightly so, because it was given to Abraham early on. We're going to reference that later, and if I don't mention it, remind me, because it's important. And it was really so much an identifier of that community that when Paul, who's already talked about how the Jews fit into this whole thing of having a witness against them as sinners, you know, the Gentiles he spoke to first, and he talked about the fact that they had a moral compass and they had a conscience to point them to their own moral compass, so that even as Gentiles, there were rules, there were things that they would say, like, you shouldn't kill people, you shouldn't murder people. There's very few cultures where murder is okay. And every thoroughly pagan culture has certain standards written on the heart by God to demonstrate the fact that we were made in the image of God, and we have some vague reminder of what righteousness really is, right? So now in this paragraph we're going to take on today, he goes one step further beyond having spoken to the Jews about the fact that if you brag about the law but you don't really keep it even in your heart, you got to ask yourself, how is that any better than the Gentiles you look down to who don't have the law, and some of whom live more by their conscience than you do, you know? And so that's why it comes up here, this discussion of circumcision. And when we talk about it today, make sure that you understand the emphasis is on the mark of community, not the surgery. The mark of community is the surgery, and just the same because of the role that it plays in the community. It's more about the community than that particular procedure. Okay. So he says, circumcision, and let's change that right now, not for our own comfort, but to emphasize what I was saying. The mark of being in the covenant community, takes a lot longer to say. The mark of being in the covenant community indeed is of value if you obey the laws. But if not, if you break the law, your community mark might as well be absent. Okay? That's a paraphrase designed to bring, hopefully, the teaching up to you so you can hear what Paul is really saying to them. The God of Israel undeniably made a covenant, established a relationship in Abraham and with his descendants that was unique and was a precursor, a hint of what God was going to do through the community of faith that we would come to understand after the finished work of Christ. He said to them, that he would be their God, and they would keep his laws. And they had the mark to remind them of that relationship. Now, what we're dealing with here is that the external mark, which is of such great value in that community, Paul is going to tell us and wants us to understand is irrelevant if you're not really in that covenant relationship with God. And the interesting thing for me about this covenant relationship is how clearly in the Old Testament, given what Paul is saying in the New Testament, it was demonstrated that this was doomed to fail from the beginning because of sin. Right? It's not something new when Paul tells the Jew that your circumcision doesn't count for much if it's not backed up with the reality of life in the covenant community. It's just a ceremony then. And I'm going to talk a little bit about baptism in a moment, but I want to talk to you about Exodus. And many of you may even know where to go in Exodus to find the Ten Commandments. It's in chapter 20. That's right, chapter 20. The interesting thing that happens there when the people of God have been redeemed from Egypt and brought out into the wilderness to the Mount of God, where most believe Moses first encountered God in the burning bush, to receive the law so that they could go from being a nomadic community trying to do its best, or certainly no longer a slave community because they've been set free, to be a nation, a people of God's own calling. And what do you need to be a nation? You need a government. And what do you need for government? Many would argue, and I think that Scripture says the rule of law that we mentioned last week is part of that, right? There needs to be an organizing principle for a nation to be effective and to be gathered together and have shared values. The interesting thing about the word for law in both Greek and Hebrew is it's not really a word for codified law as we understand it today. It doesn't exclude that, you understand, but it's more about norms, standards, expectations of the community, if you understand the difference. It's not so much about tickets for driving over 60 miles an hour. By the way, dear heart, it's August now. The cameras on Roosevelt are functioning, and they will only allow you to be 11 miles over the speed limit before they will send you a really hefty sum if they see you on those cameras. They tell me that in the trial period they even clock some people at 120.
Oh yeah.
That scares me, really. But anyhow, I digress. As only I can do. So in chapter 19 of Exodus, let me read some bits of that for you. And I certainly invite you to read it more if you want to in your own time. But Exodus 19, before that law is given, and yet when they're already gathered at the mountain, God speaks to Moses, as he often did. God had called him up into the mountain. Verse 3, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings." Don't you love that? "And brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." And these are the words you shall speak to the people of Israel. Now, most people who read this, for some reason, miss what I think is a very important moment here. Because as soon as we get to the other side of the code, and we start getting more and more code, we learn that in that nation of God's people, the priests are going to be one tribe. They're going to be the Levites. But here, on this side of the giving of the code, God says to Moses, you're going to be my people, and you're going to be a kingdom of priests. God is saying that he wants to be in a relationship with the whole nation, not just with a small band of representatives, but with every one of them. What a wonderful thing. The sad thing is that when Moses comes down from the mountain and says to him, hey guys, we got to wash up, we got to get ready, we got to be our best, because the day is shortly coming when we will meet our God, and he's going to talk to us. And they did. They even put barriers around the mountain as God suggested, because God was going to be on the mountain, just like God being in the bush. He told Moses to take off his shoes. There is a need for us to understand the presence of the Holy, make certain demands on us, but that's a sermon for another time. And so they did all of that, and the day came, and God revealed himself in thunder and clouds and so forth on the mountain, and gave the code, the Ten Commandments that we are so familiar with. And this is the response in chapter 20 to all of that. Verse 18, when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled. Well, that far I'm with them. You know, when God is behind the pyrotechnics, it's going to be a show. And, you know, in a culture that didn't know what fireworks were, this would be a little bit terrifying, right? There's still people today who don't want to go and see fireworks. They find it terrifying. So they say to Moses, you speak to us and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, lest we die. That's how frightened they were. But it's also the point at which they abandoned the privilege that God wanted to give them. They moved from being a nation of priests to being a nation with representatives. Now you may think I'm overselling that, but I don't think so. I think that's a really important, critical thing that happened. It shows that God's best for his people was lost early on, the same day. Now you will hear this sermon in another form when people talk about the making and the worshiping of the golden calf, right? And I think it's pretty clear that when that happened and Moses went down and saw what the people were doing, and in his anger he broke the original tablets and all of that, they had probably shattered every one of the 10 to get where they were. Because we know that the ancient Egyptians didn't worship their gods of bovine nature. Isn't it cool when you can work in a word like bovine? You graduate of Saul, or almost. You know what bovines are, right? Yes, okay. Cattle. They didn't worship them quietly. They worshiped them with physical excess of all kinds. So on that day, there was probably an abundance of fornication and adultery and taking the name of the Lord in vain, simply by worshiping this calf, you know, and idolatry and graven image and everything. In less than 40 days. Now, you've heard that sermon before, but I think you need to realize that it didn't even get that far. On the same day that God gave the law, they began their turn from God, and for what reason? Because they could not tolerate the presence of an all-righteous God. There was integrity in that. There really was. to that degree, I do not fault them. We are blessed to come before God covered with the blood. And maybe we should be a little bit more terrified more often when we have our encounters with the Almighty. But we don't have to be, because we're under the blood. And God is realizing His original intent for His covenant people of Israel in us today. How do I know that? Read Peter, where we are taught that we are a kingdom of priests, right? A kingdom of priests. Some translations, kings and priests to our God. But if we're all kings and we're all priests, then there's an equality there. We all are in the same relationship with God in the church. It doesn't mean that the gifts don't differ and all the rest of it, but as far as status and everything, every believer stands before God on the same ground as Calvary ground, before the cross. So, this covenant community that the Jews in Paul's audience, the theoretical Jews, the ones that he's speaking to on the assumption that someone in the group would give voice to these things, have to understand that there's always been a difference between simply being Jewish and being Jewish. Circumcision does not make you a Jew. It's not the magic of surgery that changes your identity. How do I know that? Do you remember reading about Abraham being given this token of separation for the new family that he would be the father of? And he himself carried out the circumcisions on all that were included. For those of us who've been watching Time Team, a sharpened flint. It changed my perspective on that completely. Flints are an indication of Stone Age culture. When they find these things, they go absolutely ecstatic about it. But they aren't something that I would want any kind of cut made on my body with. Any kind. Anyhow, who did Abraham circumcise that day? Every male of his household. Who did that include? People that were in no way related to him at all. They did not become Jews. They did not become more part of his household. He included them, I would think, because as much of anything, his enthusiasm to do the will of God. And I've often wondered how the servants responded to that. Hey, guess what Abraham has in store for us today? So, circumcision does not make you into somebody who has a relationship with God other than externally. It's important. He's going to talk about that. It's important. It's a privilege to be one of God's people. I think my mother nailed it years ago when she said, it's a great thing to be a born-again believer. It's a slightly better thing to be a born-again Jew, because you're part of the physical community of God's people as well as part of the spiritual community of God's people. I don't know if that would stand up to the test of theologians, but it works for me. For no one, in verse 28, no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical. The reality, in other words, is not outward, it is not the physical. A Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart. And in the Old Testament, God even talks about improving the relationship with those who will repent by circumcising the heart. Trust me, that was not done actually. That was a spiritual matter. A matter of the heart by the Spirit, not the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God. No one is ever congratulated, I don't think, outside of the true believer community understands is a Jew for being a Jew. That's not been their history. They have been brutalized. They have been persecuted. They have been the object of genocide. But in God's eyes, a true Jew, whose heart is right with God, will hear God say, I love you. I love you. You are mine. It has always been this way. I cannot emphasize enough that Paul is not introducing a new concept, a new standard, from the external to the internal. He's not doing that. You know how I know? One of the classic verses of Scripture, 1 Samuel 16. God has sent Samuel to anoint the next king of Israel because he's chucking Saul out of the job, right? And he's sent to the household of David and his father, and there are 8 sons in that household. And 7 of them are brought before Samuel, and from the very first, Samuel thought, when he saw the firstborn, he thought, now that's a king. Based on looks, on external things, which was also the impression they had with Saul when they first saw him. He was head and shoulders above everyone in Israel. He was a tall dude. He was regal in his size and stance. And God said to Samuel, no, that's not the one. 6 more times he said, nope, that's not him. And Samuel was getting a little confused, and he had the good sense to say, you got another son? And basically, a broad paraphrase of the Hebrew is, yeah, the brat's out taking care of the sheep. That's, you know. What do you do with the baby of the family, right? Call him in. But before that happened, God had sent something to Samuel that he must have shared with others that is a guiding principle for biblical interpretation all the way to the end. I want you to know something, Samuel, God says. Man looks on the outward appearance. God looks on the heart. There are a lot of people who have fooled a lot of people about what they really are and about what God knows. And when and if they ever stood before God and said, I'm here, open the gates of heaven, God would say, no. I know what you've been up to all these years in your heart. And you don't have the marks of my son. You're not forgiven. Some have said, and I want to say this quickly, that baptism and circumcision, that there's some kind of quality there, Old Testament sign, New Testament sign. And I can't go into all the theology of that now. We'll be here for another hour. But sufficient to say, there's an enormous difference that speaks against equating them completely. Because when Isaac was circumcised, he was circumcised as the son of Abraham. He was circumcised according to his birth. He was circumcised according to the realities of who he was in the human community. When a believer enters the waters of baptism upon profession of their faith, I am not testifying to what I am making myself to be, or what the pastor is making me to be, or what the priest is making me to be, by passing through the waters of baptism. I am testifying to what Christ did on Calvary's tree. And the fact that his blood atones for my sin. I'm testifying to something that is real and has already taken place. Not a promise, but a reality. And I believe in the promises of God. You understand what I'm saying? But it's enormously different in my mind. Although, simply put, circumcision is the mark of the Jewish community and its relationship with God. And baptism marks me out by the dint of my testimony as a participant in the community of faith that God has established.